So my name is Tu. I'm a co-founder and CEO at StableLab. I'm also BD lead at DeFi protocol called MakerDAO. But for this one, we're going to talk mostly about DAO and governance. So let's get into it. So a lot of, I would say, people, when they talk about DAO, they like to say that this is something that really solves all the problems. But we have realized that, of course, it's not as simple as that. But we do get a lot of people who say that, like, okay, like, being a DAO can solve a lot of different issues from, let's say, token price and others. And we are saying that in reality, it is actually more difficult, right? Like a lot of different, let's say, DAOs, they just put the name DAO and expect to be decentralized, but in reality, it's not as simple as that. So there are more DAOs than ever, and then right now there are more DAOs every day. There are new ones coming up. And then we realize that there are a lot of issues with those DAOs, right? So we generally don't hear about how good DAOs are. We hear about how they have dramas and how dysfunctional they are. In fact, generally people know DAOs for dramas they cause. And then at least that's considered as a good one because there are some DAOs that suffer from governance attacks. And this is something that we, of course, want to avoid. So for StableLab, we have contributed to over 25 different DAOs, and some of them are very large. And then we have contributed to more than 2,800 different votings. And our philosophy has been that we try to apply from the theory and then put into practice. So you can imagine that people on the practice, if you think this is like a, let's say, war, then there are people in the trenches who are actually fighting. And then there are people who give us, okay, maybe try it this way or others, and then we go there and try it in the governance, and then we come back to them and let them know how it worked, right? So maybe it didn't work well, or maybe it worked. And then, so for us, so through this, we can help to examine and then try to extract some of the good parts about those successful DAOs, and then try to experiment with it. And then, so the interesting part about today is that we want to kind of talk about some of those are not black and white. And a lot of it is about different doses. So to give an example, a lot of people talk about checks and balances. And then for checks and balances, for a lot of people say, well, accountability, and those are very important. And that is true, that a lot of these different proposals, they usually have token holders that try to be, let's say, give accountability to it. But at the same time, a lot of issues has been that that's actually not generally what happens, right? Like a lot of DAOs, they don't have enough accountability, which has been the issue. And then we have seen, for example, a lot of different DAOs, they might, for example, have big grants, and then there's actually not a good way to try to enforce it. And then they give the money, and they don't know what happened to it. By the way, for this one, we're gonna just go through quick because I kind of believe in having it, based on discussion. So it'll be more Q&A and then just discuss more. And then at the same time, it's also possible that there might be too much accountability, which sounds very strange. But sometimes if you have too much checks and balances, it can cause a lot of different gridlock for the DAO. One of the good examples I like to mention is from actually MakerDAO. And then before the end game, for the process for real-world asset was quite long and pretty complex. So you actually had to go through, let's say, approval from different domains at Maker. So you can imagine that not only do you have to go through one, but you have to go through many different checks. So in the end, it was actually very difficult for those to be part of real-world asset at Maker. So that was also the reason why the process itself had to change. So you can imagine that having this too much can also cause troubles as well. Now, in terms of participation, we have seen that a lot of DAOs don't have enough people participating, which has been a big problem. So this is, for example, looking at Uniswap and looking at the voters. And you can see that the number of voters at Uniswap has been declining a lot. Now, the only reason why it's still functional is because they have delegates. So for delegates, because they get the voting power from all of those voters, although the total number of voters are decreasing, it's still functional, but of course, it's not ideal. And it has been a big problem for a lot of DAOs where they don't see enough voters. Now, there are many reasons for such, including that there's high gas costs, as well as there's no real reward or compensation for those who participate in governance. But we have seen that this can be a big issue because when you have a very little participation, that also means that it's very difficult to know, like for example, the feedback regarding different proposals, as well as to ensure that whether those proposals are good or less bad. Now, it's also possible, for example, it has happened that some of those proposals, let's say that they go there and then they don't pass. And because people don't give feedback, they don't actually know why it's failing, right? It's almost like, let's say if you have a girlfriend and then she's mad at you, she doesn't tell you why she's mad at you, so you have to try to guess. But if there's a feedback on, let's say, why she's mad at you, that's probably easier, right? So similarly, at DAOs, having those people to participate, to give feedback, can be very crucial. Now, another interesting, I would say, expectation and also reality difference is that a lot of different protocols like to think that ideal DAO culture is where everybody participates. So, for example, it can be, let's say, team members, it can be token holders, it can be some random people on Twitter, and that they believe that the more people participate, the better. But in reality, it's different because you can also have an issue with too much participation because once again, it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. So you can have people, for example, asking for different airdrops. They might go and try to give their feedback, which are actually not that productive, right? So a lot of people like to, make a joke that DAO is a bit like a boat that's sinking, that of course, like let's say there's a big issue you want to bring up, but then there are a lot of different people giving their feedback or their opinion, which maybe is not so crucial for DAO itself. And then you can also have an issue where, for example, this is from Lido DAO, and then basically, now it's a bit solved, but back then they made it very easy for people to put up proposals. The issue has been that because it's very easy for people to put up proposals, it also meant that they can put up proposals that are malicious, or let's say are bad. So a lot of those are actually scam proposals, but they couldn't, they had to manually basically close it, right? Because at least based on their parameter, there was actually no way to enforce it. Now, there's also issue with the transparency as well. Now, we are, for example, familiar with a lot of the issues that has happened over the past few years, whether that's, let's say, FTX to Celsius to, let's say, Terra. And then having that kind of lack of transparency also means that, for example, whether that's money or, let's say, this kind of management or others are difficult to track. And that also means that it's more likely to fall into, let's say, misuse and others. Now, this also happens from the DAO level as well. Our team also has recognized, as well as some others, talk about how a lot of governance is a governance theater where people like to act as decentralized. And I think that there's some truth to it as well, where like in reality, although a lot of DAOs or let's say foundations and teams, they say they want to be decentralized, but in reality, they are also a bit worried or unhappy with what's happening because a lot of times what DAOs do might be different from what they want, right? But it is also important to ensure that there is this transparency to ensure that, let's say, they want to be more decentralized, then actually it shows rather than just having it as this kind of theater. Now, you can also have an issue with maybe too much transparency as well, because the thing is that if you're, let's say, DAO, and you have a complete transparency, it's also difficult to have certain kind of engagement. So you can imagine a case, let's say, that you want to have this very big secret deal with a very big partner, and they ask you to sign an NDA. Well, then can you keep it, let's say, secret? Or if it's like very transparent, then you might have to share it, right? So although it sounds like very in theory, it does happen. And then for example, for, some of the DAOs, like let's say MakerDAO, because it doesn't have a company, it does come to some of those issues where like, okay, who's the one that has to sign it, and those kind of issues, right? And then also, if you have too many less transparency and too many updates, then it's also possible that it's difficult for people to actually keep updated because there are just too many updates, and then there's like too much information, and there's a limited time that people can spend on, right? So in reality, some of the transparency might have to be sacrificed for some of the efficiency. And then it also happens that if you have too much transparency, it can actually lead to more misuse of funds or others as well. So one of the good examples that happened with MakerDAO was that so before Endgame, what happened was that because everybody could see how much people are getting paid, for example, you can still go and see how much I'm getting paid and how much everybody at Maker is getting paid. So you can imagine that, let's say that you're somebody from, let's say, Croatia, and be like, hey, those guys from California, they're getting paid twice as more. Are you saying that I'm not as talented as the guy from California? Probably not. They're both talented, but then a lot of times, when you do salary negotiation, it's based on regions, right? But it's also very unpopular for people to be like, oh, because you're, let's say, based in Europe, you guys have a happier life and you guys have more sunlight, so you guys can get paid less. That doesn't really work, right? So what happened was that because of that, actually people wanted more and more salary. And then you can imagine that some of the people were like, hey, I saw that they're getting paid this much. We also want to get paid more. So it became this kind of race for people to ask for more salary. And it became very unpopular to not approve it because nobody wants to say no to people saying, hey, because our colleagues are getting paid more, we deserve to get paid more. So that's why you saw that although income has been going down, the expense was keep going up. Now, once the ending game came, that of course changed a lot of different things. But you can imagine that having that kind of too much transparency can cause this kind of sense of unfairness as well. I mean, there's a reason why, for example, if you're working at a more traditional company, you probably don't know what your colleagues are making unless your HR is really drunk and tells you about it, possible, or your colleagues. So there's you can imagine there's no HR at DAOs, so that happens. Now, so in summary, we talk about some of the challenges that DAOs are facing. Now, we've been pioneering a lot of this and then have been researching quite a bit. But there's also misunderstanding, like what is perfect DAO? There's no such thing as like having like perfect DAO. It's just more about having a balance between extremes. And then we just want to avoid some of those extremes. Now, that's it for the presentation itself. Now, as I shared earlier, I'd like to have a section where you guys might have questions or discussion points, because once again, it's DAO. I know that a lot of people talk about DAOs, but at the same time, it's something that will be better with the discussion. So if you have any questions, maybe you can raise your hand or ask. Also, I see some familiar faces. Hi. All right, anybody have any questions? Also, don't worry, I'm not going to judge you. We're here for learning anyway. Okay, yes, Karina, yes. What question do you have?
I have a question. What do you think? Do you have any suggestions for the current DAOs? What mechanisms they have in the future? Like, what are your hopes for what should work really well in the future?
Okay, so the question was, okay.
Basically, the challenges you see.
Okay, so the question was, okay, so based on the challenges that DAOs face, what kind of model would we recommend them to take? And I think that really depends on DAOs. Well, the first thing is that we tell a lot of teams that, so a lot of them come to us and ask that they want to be a DAO, and our first question is that, are you sure about that, that you want to be a DAO? And then the second question we usually ask is, are you sure about your first answer? Because a lot of foundation and teams, they say they want to be a DAO, but they actually don't really want to be a DAO. Or they don't really understand what DAO kind of means. So our recommendation is like, if you're a kind of, let's say, team or foundations or that kind of structure where you want to at least be more hands-on in the first type, we generally recommend you to try more council model. So Synthetics and others, they are in a model where you have a kind of council model. The benefit of council model is that you don't have to engage with governance directly per se, because you can, for example, invite, or let's say the community can have people who've been committed. So it's also easier to coordinate, right? Like it's easier to coordinate, let's say, like 7 people or 9 people who are leading the governance than trying to negotiate with or discuss with like hundreds or potentially thousands of people who are mostly like, let's say, users. So that's one. Now for others, of course, the traditional methods, they have their benefits as well. But I would definitely recommend at least having some delegate program, because even if you're, let's say, a big investor, generally they don't really want to engage in governance for long term. So it's more important that you have a delegate program where those investors then can delegate to people they trust, or let's say delegates they trust, for them to engage. Now that's another way. They're having some interesting experiments happening. But the reason why we don't hear about it is because a lot of them don't really work well. Governance itself doesn't really work well. And that's the thing, is like, if governance works well, people don't really talk about it. That's why we usually hear about the dramas. But yeah, that has been something that has been explored. So either console or traditional model, or there can be some experiments, yes. All right, anybody has any questions? You can also tell me that why you think that DAOs are useless, or that's fine too. I hear that quite a lot. But yeah, anybody else? Okay, yes.
All right, yeah, one question. Would you think that DAOs is at the moment the best way to run projects, like the decentralized projects, or do you think this will develop into something totally different?
Okay, so the question was that whether think that DAOs are best way to run decentralized organizations. I would say DAOs are probably the worst form, but that's the only one of the at least tested form, is I think how I would like to put it, because DAOs can have a lot of issues, and we have in this scene that a lot of DAOs that, for example, either they become dysfunctional or they even get attacked. But at the same time, if you're in a situation where you want to minimize a lot of the trust factor, then of course you want to have it, let's say, DAO format. Now, the difficult part is that as we talk about governance, a lot of people like to think like, okay, governance is this, but governance, if you think about it, is very broad, right? Like even in traditional, let's say, politics, or let's say either corporate or let's say policymakers, politics and those governance are very, very broad ideas, right? So governance by itself is decision making. So you can kind of imagine that even if you're in a situation where, let's say, it's DAO, even if you want to make it that like, okay, we want to make it into a DAO where, let's say, it's decentralized, at the end of the day, you need to trust somebody, right? Or at least you need to trust the system. And sure, like there are people who will be like, hey, but we made it based on smart contracts, so everything is perfect. Well, then A, you need to trust the smart contract is secure, and two is then, well, then who's gonna watch the watchers? That becomes the question about, okay, well, if you have somebody that helps to guard the system, then somebody needs to watch them, and somebody needs to watch them too, and it just becomes turtles all the way down. So once again, going back to it, it's like there's no perfect answer, but at least based on the ways that try to be more decentralized, it is the one of the form that has been at least tested that can work. Of course, it's going to fail most of the times, and that's fine. That's just the nature of the, I would say, industry. All right, any others? Oh, by the way, I know that I'm being very skeptical about DAOs and others, but I'm not that skeptical. We're just saying that, like, if you want to be a DAO, don't. But if you actually are a DAO, then we need to talk more to try to at least fail less. That's kind of our idea. All right, anybody have any other questions? You can also give me some recommendations for food in Split as well. That's also something that we can talk about. Can we decide your DAO's decisions? All right, anybody else has any questions? Okay, well, I mean, at least it was not something like any DAO that we should invest in or something like that, because I cannot respond to that. If I knew that, I wouldn't be here, right? So, all right. Because there's still like 10 minutes, maybe we'll take one or two more questions, and then we can leave you guys to enjoy lunch. Any other questions? Okay, so that's a very interesting question. You sound like our investor at this point. So she asked, okay, what's the goal of StableLab itself? So StableLab, as we kind of described, like we are contributing to quite many DAOs. The reason why we started doing governance in the first place was actually not, like we didn't start doing governance, so we actually started as a more investment company. So we invest in different entities, and then we ask them, okay, we asked our portfolio companies, what do you need help with? And then they say two things. One was they need help with the business development. They say that they want us to connect with this investor, this company. And then they say they need help with governance because they try to set up DAO, but there are not many companies that work on it. So that's why we start to do governance. And then because our team, like me and my co-founder, we have been doing governance at Maker. So we had a lot of PTSD from doing it. So we were like, okay, might as well do it. So we started to do it. So for us, it's of course like governance is something that's very, I would say, unexplored, and we want to explore more to ensure that many other organizations that do want to implement such can learn from some of the mistakes and case studies, and we help to implement at least, once again, there's no perfect DAO, but at least like reduce the error to ensure that it's more efficient and also ensure that there's less drama. But at the same time, dramas are the best part of DAO. That's why you don't need to subscribe to Netflix if you're in DAO governance. It's perfect, right? But yeah, so that's kind of the answer. All right, yes, your gentleman.
Can you talk more about the end game of MakerDAO? Like, was all this drama, right, about going to Solana, at the end using it as an end game? So is this still happening, and what are the reasons behind it?
Yep, sure. So this is more related to, so the question was about MakerDAO and the end game, and then the drama with the, well, I shouldn't say drama, just discussion about that. So for Maker, for Endgame itself, there are actually quite a lot of changes, but actually one of, I guess I can go back. No, I cannot go back. Okay, so other way, like one of the issue with MakerDAO has been that as it became DAO itself, because before Maker used to have a foundation, that's where I also used to work, but then after it became dissolved, it truly became a DAO. And then when it became like that, then it became that like a lot of the decisions and also initiative need to be moved fast, but it was very difficult. Because once again, if you're a DAO and there's like checks and balances everywhere, it's very difficult to proceed with it. Plus, of course, there were also the discussion about how to ensure that, let's say, Maker is able to innovate fast enough. So we're kind of in the gridlock, and the end game helped to resolve that, basically having a new initiative, including some of the ways for Maker to expand further. As you know, people sometimes call us the boomer fight because Maker is very slow. But I must admit that at the same time, there also has been some of our strengths. But we also recognize that Maker right now, we are in the world where there are many different protocols and also many different ideas. So in terms of the Solana thing was basically discussion about potentially Maker having its own chain, especially for governance aspect. Now, to give you some reasoning behind it was basically in case if, for example, Maker actually has to come to, so to give you a context for those who are not familiar with Maker, Maker is a stablecoin project. And then we have cryptocurrency as a collateral. Now, in case, for example, Maker decides to shut down because of, let's say, hack or some kind of extreme situation, if you're on, let's say, another chain, let's say Ethereum or others, like currently, it is actually quite difficult to ensure that, let's say, this shutdown is implemented quite smoothly. And we have seen that as well. But if there's, for example, on-chain, at least on the governance front, then it's easier. Plus, also, with the end game, a lot of the idea was that basically you get to interact quite a lot. And then a lot of those interactions in traditional, let's say, each mainnet would cause a lot of chaos. So it was seen as maybe it's possible to have a kind of new, model. So there was some discussion about potentially like, forking Solana to use their model, but once again, it's not things that's like confirmed. In fact, Maker is open to different ideas and exploring. So Maker never really committed to, let's say, use Solana. Now, in terms of drama about it, of course, there's because Maker is a very old project. You can imagine that there are different ideas on how Maker should move forward. But at the same time, like now that more and more people have a similar voice to ensure that it's moving in the right direction. But once again, right is very subjective term, so I would say the last bet direction is probably the correct way. All right, any other questions? Okay, we have, I think, like 5 minutes, so I think they can be a last question, and then just let you guys go. Okay. Well, I mean, it seems like there's no more questions, so I think I'll just leave you guys to enjoy lunch and then enjoy the nice weather of Split. Once again, thank you so much for coming, and if you have any questions, just send me a message. You can also tell me if I should be less funny or more funny. I appreciate both sense of humor, so, thank you so much.